Thank you so much for coming, and I'm just going to center us in the conversation a bit before really getting us going for the evening. So the idea behind these sessions, which are 10 forward, are to talk about the space ahead. And the idea is to have an open conversation about interesting concepts and where we might go and how we might build on where we've come. So I'll introduce myself, then I'll give an opportunity for Chris to introduce himself and talk a bit about what the evening was look like. But I want to say very importantly, as the conversation today is going to talk about decolonization, that I'm speaking from the unceded territory of the Sliammon Nation, which is also known as Lasqueti, British Columbia. But to also remember that colonialism is ongoing here and that we have a responsibility to work on that currently. So I am a candidate for leader of the Green Party of Canada, and we put forward a platform that is, the whole concept behind it is to bring up conversations of how we want to develop policy as the membership and explore ideas and center around the idea of justice, safety, equity, and decolonization at its heart. So that's where we're coming from tonight. The conversation will be me basically interviewing / facilitating a discussion about the one-state solution and also decolonization. And then after that, kind of open question and answers from the floor. And yeah, so Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
I sure would. Hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Zabaneh. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the unceded territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. I believe it's the Huron, the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, I believe one more First Nations band. It's great to be here. I am a Palestinian Canadian in that I was born in Canada. My family is Palestinian on my father's side, and on my mom's side, a bit of an Arab mutt, with a bit of Syrian in there, a bit of Lebanese. So I jokingly call myself an Arab mutt. I have some family members here, some other Zabanehs. My father was the second Zabaneh in Canada. He actually pulled a Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. He was at a protest at his school closing by soldiers in Palestine, in the West Bank. And the story goes that he was at this protest. The two tall guys, because he's shorter than me, the two tall guys next to him were arrested. And then he came, his grandmother wanted him to, or my grandmother, his mother wanted him to go somewhere else, go somewhere safe to learn. So he got sent to Canada. Now, of course, my dad's on the call. He can correct me on the details, but if I use the word Fresh Prince of Bel-Air in there, it sounds much more understandable to some folks on the call. So I'm happy to have a discussion today about some concepts on the one-state solution. Big disclaimer, we're not going to solve the Middle East peace process in a Zoom call in an hour and change. I'm also not an encyclopedia. It's funny, whenever we talk about aspects of decolonization, people always want you to have every single detail at your fingertips. I don't have a PhD in this, but I have some good references and we'll be able to talk through some of the broader concepts. I really want to introduce this idea to all of you on the call and those on the Green Party, because as Amita was talking about, this is rooted not just in decolonization, but in universal human rights. It's going to be a fun discussion. And at some point, we'll also talk about defining some terms as well. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So I wanted to start by giving a little bit of context for myself and where I come at this from. And I think to center it a little bit about what the purpose is. And to me, I have existed between a lot of identities, whether racially or gender or anything. And my family comes from a number of different places. And it informs for sure my commitment to justice. And that commitment is to every single person. And so what I want more than anything else is for us to explore the possibilities of our future in a way that is going to be best for everyone. And in that, I want to share a bit of my personal background, because in no way am I an expert on this. I just think this conversation is important to be had. And so defining terms is part of that, but also understanding context. So my father was adopted in 1945 by a German Jewish family. And I have with me, in remembrance of my grandmother, who married her cousin to escape World War II Germany. And that is why my dad exists the way he is. That's the way his life has been defined. And I have celebrated, a Jewish life with that side of my family and everything that they went through. And I remember at my grandmother's 100th birthday party. We had no idea because she never spoke of anything. When we went there, somebody was at her 100th birthday who said that my grandmother had returned to Germany and signed her papers in Kindertransport. And if it wasn't for her, she would have died. And my grandmother never spoke of these things because it was too much. She was a mediocre mother to my father because of her life and everything that she had to be through it. So it's deeply personal. And the well-being of people, the survival of culture is all extremely important. So that, to me, is one part of it. And the other is the spirit of collaboration and working with everybody, meeting everybody where they are. And I had the great honor of going to COP25 this last year. And I did so as a guest of the state of Palestine. And I carry with me the gift of having held the space for them in the international context so that they can still stay in negotiations and be recognized. So I want nothing more than lasting peace, the rights for everybody. And when I come to our decolonization policy, the concepts that we bring forward with that, it's about sovereignty. It's about rights for everybody. It's about self-determination. And it's about a conversation that goes beyond judgment, but goes to a place where we even dig into the colonial concepts that keep us separate and that tell us that it's give or take and that we can't find a way to live with each other and that we can't have our resources in a way that we actually all survive and flourish. And that's the concept of questioning that will lead us, I think, in this country and around the world into a stable future. So with that and with my context, I think it's really important in these conversations that they're as clear as they can be. And in our platform, you know, it's suggestions for discussion, but it also was put through a lot of work to be something that's easy to communicate and accessible. And part of that is pushing past the jargon and what we mean when we say things so that we can all be on the same page in the conversation. So Chris, you're welcome to talk about the definitions of the context of the conversation for tonight.
Yes, thank you for that. One of the first things you want to state is that in this entire discussion, I'm standing on the principles and values of universal human rights. That means that no one individual's life is more important or more valuable than another person's life. It's a really challenging topic because as soon as someone finds out, oh, hey, you're Palestinian, you must hate Jews and also be Muslim. I'm like, well, neither of those things. There are Christian Palestinians. I don't hate any particular religion. I don't hate any religions. They're just religions. They have some beauty to them and they have some drawbacks as well. When we're talking about the state of Israel or the Israeli military or the actions the state or military have taken, this in no way is a critique or critical of the Jewish people. Jewish people are not a monolith. Christians are not a monolith. Muslims are not a monolith. When we're talking about Israel, we're not talking about Jewish people. Those are different things. It's like saying if I'm criticizing the American government or criticizing America or nuts to America, we're not saying we don't like Christians, which is the predominant religion there. It's simply the state and the military and the actions of the state and military. Other fun facts is that governments can be as pure or as corrupt as any other governments in any other parts of the world. So criticizing the government or its leaders, it could be its current government, governments in the past. I'm not going to shy away from some very strong terms around what the ideology or the governments or the militaries have been doing in the occupation, but we're also going to separate that very clearly. One more really key thing, the term Zionist comes up a lot. There is a Venn diagram. There are people who are Zionists. There are people who are Jewish. There is some overlap. It's not entire. You can have Christian Zionists who have their own serious problems which you can talk about elsewhere. So Zionism is a political ideology. It is not synonymous with being Jewish. If anyone is criticizing the concept of Zionism, they're criticizing the concept of a political ideology that at the time was founded in the colonial settler mentality of the late 1800s anyways. We have those terms out of the way. Can we all agree that we're not here to bash any particular religion? And if you are, we would kindly ask you to not do that at all and to educate yourself and to especially not do it here in this moment. Fair game? Show of thumbs for those on video. We can agree to this? Outstanding. Okay. I'm also not going to allow any of the I often call this the I have a black friend defense, which is, oh, I can't be racist, I have a black friend. Or I can't be bad in this way, I have a Muslim friend, or I have an Israeli friend, or I have a Jewish friend. That's not how this goes. We're talking about universal human rights. Great. Now that we've spent some time defining those terms and making everyone rather uncomfortable, we can dive into it. How do you want to start, Amita?
So I think my background understanding of hearing about Middle East policy has always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because it always sounds like it's colonial in the first place. That people are saying, well, I think I have an answer, and I'm going to tell you what to do. And here's some border concepts. And here's the definition of identity. Here's the definition of who you are, what your group means, and everything to do with that. And it has bugged me from the concept of how you actually work on solutions building in the first place. And then add on top of that, the decolonial lens. So I was very curious to hear about the one state solution and the possible conversations of how you actually talk about finding understanding of states and all of that. And so I would love to hear, or I'd love to have you share the basics.
Okay, let's start into it. The concept of a state, even the term itself, has changed over time. In Theodor Herzl's time, in the late 1800s, when the Jewish state was written, which is the manifesto of the Zionist ideology, again, political movement, a state was a self-contained unit. It wasn't necessarily what we would define now as a country. You could describe it as almost like a province or a self-contained sort of unit. So the concept of a Jewish country is different than a state. Let's talk briefly. I'm not going to go into the long history of the Middle East because that's kind of a mess. As many people know, people always ask me, where are you from? And I'll say where the tanks are. The history, the region, the historic Palestine, has been occupied by various military forces and crusades and other groups for thousands of years. That's nothing new to the region. So this concept of what does it mean in the current colonial lens, we're currently talking about the post-British Mandate period. I don't want to get lost in the details of this, but in short, here's a couple key facts you have to figure out. You have to know. There have always been Jewish Palestinians, Christian Palestinians, Muslim Palestinians, Baha'i Palestinians, Druze Palestinians, Palestinian being the nationality with different religions. The separation between those, calling them now Jews and Palestinians, is a rather recent phenomenon, which doesn't quite stick. In fact, if you look behind me, there was a very famous Visit Palestine poster. It's kind of small on everyone's tiny screens. It was actually made by a Jewish Palestinian in the, I want to say 30s at some point, early 30s. We don't have to dive into the history of the region and the occupation and all of the bait and switch that the various colonial governments, or various colonial forces in the region, the French and the British, put forward. But what I want us to understand from this is that the current problem was created by external forces. Britain, France, the UN saying, let's draw lines on a map. What's that quote? Most of the world's problems can be traced back to a British person saying, drawing lines on a map, something along those lines. So the colonial aspect is really challenging, and it's a really terrible one to discuss because it is steeped in the Holocaust. There were Jewish refugees who were fleeing Europe, both before, during, and after the Holocaust. They went many places, and many came to the Middle East and came to what's known as historic Palestine, then under the British Mandate. Don't worry, this boring part isn't going to last much longer. The one interesting thing I like to say, which really humanizes an aspect of this conflict, was my family, my dad's side of the family, had a home in Ramle. And it was a large family home, and there were some orange trees and orange orchards there. They were run out by the Haganah in 1948. These were Jewish militias that were effectively, they were ethnically cleansing the area, getting the Palestinian Christians and Muslims out of the area. So my family fled with what they had on their backs, pretty much. And later, that very same home was given by the Jewish National Fund. It was given to a family of Holocaust survivors. So I want this to sink in for a moment. People who were run out of their home were given a home that was once owned by people who were then run out of their home, by the people who were run out of their home. It's very confusing, but it's very strange and odd. What does this have to do with the current colonial context? There's a lot. I could talk about this for a long time. The gist of it is there is no Palestinian state. The state of Israel controls pretty much everything. What you're hearing about a Palestinian Authority is effectively a myth. It's effectively sanctioned jailers from the state of Israel. It's there to offload a lot of responsibility from the state of Israel. The current colonial context basically means it's very hard to figure out how to quote unquote solve a problem or separate two states when it's not clear what those are. So when we talk about a one state solution, it's instead of saying, let's build some fences, let's carve things up into what's been aptly described as apartheid and Bantustans. Instead, it's saying, okay, you know what? There are people here who are Jewish. There are people here who are Christian, Muslim. If we want to have any sort of real peace, we have to have one country where everyone can live with universal human rights. This idea was talked about very clearly by Ali Abu Nima about 15 years ago. The most recent thrust in the liberal Zionist community has come from the author Peter Beinart, who talked about he no longer believes in a two-state solution. There's a lot more complexities to it, but the easiest way is to show you with a picture about what the current land looks like, and then we'll bring it back into something a little less dry, a little less history lesson, because there is no easy way to talk about this quickly and easily. So I'll show you a picture. We can all see this picture now, yes? There's multiple monitors. Okay. This is over time. 1947, partition plan from the UN in the second panel, and the third panel before the 67 war and land was taken there. Then the present. So you see there is no Palestinian state. It's a series of small isolated areas intercut with hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers. So there are lots of Jewish Israeli settlers in the West Bank. They're there. It's very hard to separate them out. So this idea of a two-state, what's the two-state? There's no real way to easily separate what's there unless you were to kick out all of the Israeli settlers from the 1967 borders, which is actually what the Green Party policy states. If you look at our policy, it basically says, take it back to the 67 borders, which is kicking them out. And we don't want to dislocate any more people than we have to. I'm going to stop for a moment because I don't want to get lost in history lessons and he said, she said. It's going to make things very awkward. I could talk a lot about the history of Palestinian activism and the history of fighting for self-determination. That's not going to work with the context of this discussion. I want to bring forward the idea of a one-state solution. Binational, similar in many ways to what we have going on in Canada with English and French, to what's going on in Belgium with the Flemish and the Walloons, the French and Swiss type languages and folks that are there. And by the way, I am, despite being a public speaking trainer, I haven't talked about this in public before. So I'm not as sharp or clear as I'd like to be. And because I have a lot riding on this, what's the problem being any sort of minority group is that all of a sudden you speak for the entire minority. So if you say something wrong, it's all your fault. And it's an awkward mantle to wear. By focusing on a one-state solution with equal human rights for all, by focusing on truth and reconciliation, similar to what was happening in what happened in South Africa, by allowing the right of return for all of the expelled millions of Palestinian refugees who were kicked out of their home and have nothing to show for it, who want to come back and live in their homeland. By focusing on this concept of a single binational state, a federated republic, there are lots of different ways to break it down. We can then return to this concept of universal human rights. We can stop dealing with these colonial aspects of stealing water from the Palestinian people, of denying them land, of denying them human rights, access to medicine, access to love. If you're Palestinian and you live in the 48 borders, what's commonly called Israel now, and you fall in love with someone who lives in the West Bank, you can't live together. It's not allowed. So there's all these weird laws that are set up to make an ethnically cleansed state to slowly over time get Palestinians out of there and make their lives miserable. We need to focus on a single state where everyone has the same human rights. There are a lot of people who disagree with this, because to many, this takes away the concept of a Jewish state. But to support the state of Israel as it is currently is to support an ethno-national state where there is a concept of, it is effectively Jewish supremacy, where if you are Jewish or have Jewish heritage, you are given more rights and freedoms, and the law is on your side, and the systems are on your side. It's a very challenging place to be. So if the goal is to have safety for Jewish people in what's commonly called Israel-Palestine, then by continuing to have separate states, by continuing to oppress Palestinians, the minority there, by continuing to make life miserable for those in Gaza, it's only making the situation more untenable. Now, out of all the thousands of things popping up in people's minds right now, things that people agree with, things that they don't, small snippets of history I may have gotten wrong, broad important arguments I may have skipped over, I do want to talk about a few public opinion polls. And in Palestine, the support for a two-state solution is currently at around 39%. 39% of Palestinians support a two-state solution. That's not that much, and that is decreasing. 62% believe that a two-state solution is no longer possible. And this is from, what's the organization? I believe it's the Palestinian Organization on Public Opinion. I can find the exact name. I don't want to get lost in the mess of annexation, or talking about land and water rights, or talking about various other aspects of the terrible histories. What I do want to have in this discussion is how we can start to change the way we look at our discussion around the Palestinian cause, around safety for Jewish Israelis in the same way, around how our own Green Party policy is itself filled with colonial language that is completely devoid of what's actually happening in the Middle East. And lastly, we can do a little neat trick. And Amita, we can look at your policy that seeks to look at decolonization in Canada and around Indigenous policies, and how we can copy and paste the words Canada with Israel and the words Indigenous and First Nations with Palestinians, and a few other neat tricks to see how those concepts still apply. And of course, as Amita and Anthony and I spoke about earlier, decolonization doesn't mean kicking people out. It means changing the way we look at our policies so they can be inclusive for all.
I'd like to speak to that a little bit before we move on. And thank you for the intro. As we go along, I think now is the perfect moment to dig into the meaning of decolonization and examine a bit that context that we've been having. And I want to say too, the idea with these events is that it doesn't make sense for me to speak about things when someone else has more personal experience, but also intellectual knowledge about stuff than I do. And it's the deference to people with expertise in this case. But I do want to talk about decolonization before we get into the details of decolonial policy and also the possibilities of what a one-state solution could be in detail. And so in our platform and the way we're approaching it really does come from that concept, that it's in itself, the worry that breaking down our colonial system means people have to go away is in itself a colonial concept. Because the idea that we shouldn't all just be able to be with reverence for the land and the people who came before us, and that necessarily you have to break it up and you have to look at ownership in that fractured and methodology that really supports the concept of building walls, of personal necessity to hoard things for yourself because there is no community for you. All of that comes from colonial concepts in the first place. And it makes sense when so many people have profited or lived well by this system that there is a fear to confronting it. But I truly believe that we will get more strength from confronting our colonial system, and that all of us who are in Canada, and including those of us who are settlers, will actually end up with a greater ability to flourish in a decolonized country. And saying country is weird sometimes when you're actually getting ready to fully reframe to nation, but it makes sense. And in that, the very nature of our foundation is rotten, but that we will all be better for a house on a solid foundation. So the metaphor that I use for Canada is that because we are founded as a colonial state, we do have a rotten foundation. But if you have a house and a rotten foundation, you don't demolish the house. Not if the house is fine. You lift the house up, you replace the foundation, and you set the house back down. And that's the goal here. We have fundamental injustice in the formation of our country and the definition of who we are, and we will all be better off for changing that context. And in the same sense that a lot of the structures that are colonial actually oppress people and oppress us and limit us from what we can do, it is actually beneficial to everyone. And so that concept is something that I would like to see, generally Canada has this problem on the international stage of talking about itself really well. We have a lot of problems at home. And it's about taking responsibility. And then it's about talking about this in the context where it belongs everywhere. And what it means for us personally, what it means to me as somebody with my head in space, is that I do have this responsibility to every other living being on this planet. And there is no boundary between me and any of them, me and the nature around me. It is that same family, it is that same responsibility. So that is what I appreciate too about the concept of universal human rights underlying conversations of decolonial mindset, is that it is structured in its very basis to not leave the people out. And often the conversations from the colonial lens will always leave people out, because it comes from the idea that you always have to have one person getting something. It means someone else has to have something being taken away. And fundamentally, that's not true. And if we confront that, we'll all be better. So that's my bit about how I approach decolonization. And also, from being a settler, I won't have all the answers. I shouldn't be just proposing solutions for how everything should be done. They have to come from the conversations in the context of Canada with all the sovereign nations that are here on Turtle Island, and how we can come together to have perhaps a state that makes sense at the international level, but where in our own understanding of it is self-consistent and respects everyone's rights and sovereignty.
Groovy. So how do you want to approach the next piece? We talked about a couple of items. One is looking at our current Israel-Palestine policy for the Green Party. That's one way we can take a look at the language of what's there and how it actually doesn't really work. And in fact, continues this idea of, and by the way, we keep using this term of colonial. What we basically mean there is it's an externally imposed viewpoint. How we don't do a very good job. We even use improper words. We'll use protesters, and yet for some reason, we're not comfortable using the words Indigenous Palestinian land defenders, because that's what they're trying to do, keep aspects of their land and keep their orchards and their crops and their livelihood, stay connected to their families. What step do you want to take next, Amita? Do you want to answer a few questions, or do you want to go into some of our policy pieces?
I think we should do policy next, then go back to the possibilities and the drawbacks, or risks rather, of one state solution, and then we can go to questions.
Okay. Guess
I'm
what,
excited
folks?
for the policy
Yeah.
comparison piece. I'm just like ready to watch.
Super duped. Don't worry. This will actually be a little more interesting than you think. We're going to go through what's currently in the Vision Green this is the 2019 Green Party platform. We'll take a look just at some segments, and we'll point out how the language in itself is kind of a bit messed up. So I'm going to do a screen share here. And I'm going to share with you parts of Vision Green, and I'm going to annotate a few things. So I can't see everyone on the screen when I'm doing it. So Anthony and Amita are going to help me in case anyone wants to jump in with bits and bobs and pieces. Let's start off with a few notes. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. We have to be careful with this term conflict. Conflict usually implies that there are two equal sides. And something we hear a lot, and it's said here in a few points. Where's my highlighter function here? So first off, this idea of conflict is kind of bonkers because it implies they're both equal, where one side has a military that receives tens of billions of dollars in US foreign aid. They have helicopter gunships and tanks and the latest weaponry. And the other side has some AK-47s and some rockets made in bicycle shops. So it's called asymmetric. It's not actually an equal conflict. So that whole line there, that's got to go. What else do we have here? There's a few things that really popped out. I want the unfortunate continued source of tension. Boy, that's really understating it there. Okay, but up. There was a couple aspects where both sides are listed. Did I scooch past that here, Amita? And again, we talked about this idea of both sides. Doesn't really make sense because that implies that they're both equal when they are not. Why is
Yeah,
it
you did. Fourth line. Sorry.
Great,
Fourth
thank
line.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Why is it we don't use both sides when we talk about what's going on with Canada and Indigenous First Nations here, yet for some reason it's okay when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? The two-state solution, as we've shown you from that image, two-state there's not really much there. There's just a bunch of tiny little Bantustans. Additionally, Palestinians would not even have control over air rights, over water rights. Something like 80% of the aquifers are already under Israeli control anyways. They wouldn't have control of their borders. So again, it's not as much of a state. It's more like a bunch of interconnected cities. Religion on all sides, that's fine. Again, with the both sides mess. Again, two communities. It's not two communities. It's multiple communities. There are a whole lot of Jewish Israelis who live in Israel or in 48 occupied territories, the 48 borders rather, who don't believe in continuing the occupation. Some people like commentators such as Gideon Levy of Haaretz, which is kind of like the Star of the Star newspaper in Canada. Haaretz is that paper in Israel. He's been a great commentator and supporter of a two-state solution as well. Okay, this is where things get weird. Resolution 242. That's basically saying the 1967 borders you may have heard of. That's basically saying all the hundreds of thousands of settlers with their stolen land there and the settler-only apartheid roads, basically want to get them out of there, which is a huge challenge and would require it would be a major issue from the point of discussion about what to do for universal human rights.
I think in that context too of wanting to make sure that we stop displacing people and allow everybody to, I like to say, flourish. And
flourish, there has to be, much like in South Africa, there has to be truth and reconciliation committees, and there does have to be some form of reparations for the land that was stolen, because that's wealth that's lost. And you hear discussions of reparations for lost wealth in America as well, which is extremely important because the nation was built on their backs. Israel, the wealth there was built on the backs of many Palestinians.
And here, the erasure and genocide of all Indigenous peoples and nations, there absolutely needs to be, I mean, giving land back for one, but we need to contend with the genocide, the ongoing genocide, and the intergenerational trauma and the responsibility of the state.
This one's going to make everyone I know angry, but that's okay. This concept of the right of Israel to exist. What does that mean exactly? Because we don't talk about any other state's right to exist. And right to exist in what way? To continue with settlements and taking land and kidnapping people, throw them in jails. Currently there is an astrophysicist who is, what's his name? Imad Barghouti. He is a Palestinian astrophysicist. And I know, Amita, you're also an astrophysicist, so I thought this would ring true. Imad Barghouti is in jail. He was arrested for no reason. This happens all the time, placed in administrative detention, which can last indefinitely. And this happens quite a lot to Palestinian academics and individuals as a way to disrupt their lives and take away from the knowledge and the richness of Palestinian culture and life. So are we protecting the right of this entity to exist? It's kind of odd. And I would apply that same principle to Canada. Should we protect the right of Canada to exist if it continues to treat First Nations and Indigenous peoples here in the same way? Which is a dangerous question, because you'll have people in the right wing, the Ontario proud folks, being like, oh, you're Ontario and Canada forever. Well, in what context? What does it mean? I'll look at maybe 2 or 3 more things here, and then we'll bring it back to something a little less boring than looking at policy. Mutually agreed upon honest brokers, Canada as a bilateral. This is just more external impositions of nonsense. Palestinians want a seat at the table. We often don't get that. You'll hear things like, oh, it was a deal of a century we've been offering them, when really it's just a different arrangement of Bantustans. It's not real. It's all marketing. Call in other Arab countries. That's also not fair. It's like saying, hey, you're Asian. What does that mean? Well, you could be Korean, you could be Japanese. Do the Korean and Japanese like each other? Not necessarily. Well, they look the same and they're a part of the same region of the world. Therefore, they should all be the same. That's a mess of a way to approach any discussion. I do want to point out Hamas here. Again, let's make some people angry. If you look at Northern Ireland, you have Protestants and Catholics living together. There is a lot of tension there, but they're living together more peacefully than they ever had because they have to live in proximity with each other, and good fences don't make good neighbors. They make bad neighbors. We know that the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, decided to go political with wings of Sinn Féin and try and enter the political process and legitimize themselves. One could argue Hamas tried to do so as well in 2006, and a whole bunch of other crazy things happened, and we said, actually, no, we're going to treat you as a terrorist organization because you still have those aspects of anti-colonialism built in. Therefore, it's terrible. Now, am I saying Hamas needs to be a legitimate political entity? No. What I'm saying is we have to allow for people and governments and organizations to move towards some aspect of legitimacy, which does have to include, of course, giving up violence. I'm with you there. I do not support violence. It doesn't really work for resistance. Okay. The rest of it is pretty great. Stop building settlements. Yeah, we've tried that for a long time. It hasn't worked, and hasn't worked since Oslo. Every time we continue this idea of let's come to the table and talk about things, let's just talk, it's allowing the status quo to continue, which is continuing land grabs. If you want to see more about this, you can search for the Vision Green policy for the Green Party. But really, the concepts here are that this language itself is external, it's colonial. It doesn't talk about the will and the needs of Indigenous Palestinians, what they want. And it also doesn't talk about the need for the Palestinians to reform aspects of the Palestinian Authority, which hasn't had an election in like 14, 15 years. It's got its own series of issues. So we have to change the way we look at this discussion to include not just supporting a two-state solution, but to support a solution as agreed upon with Indigenous Palestinians having a seat at the table for universal human rights for all in the region, which must include reparations, truth and reconciliation, right of return for Palestinian refugees, and more. Of course, the devil's in the details. I'm going to stop the screen share. I'll now open the floor to people yelling at me.
Before you do that, I just want to speak about policy again for a second, and a bit of why I'm excited about this is because I think it breaks down a lot of the narratives that are colonially entrenched in ways that we don't even, like, it gets away from us. You can set up a lot of intentions, but unless you take a moment to look at context or to step back and to reevaluate how you've actually written stuff up and how language has evolved, or the very context from which we write and we live. And my acknowledgement in that is I'm not perfect. Never have been, never will be. I don't know everything, and I certainly won't do a good job writing stuff all the time. But hopefully with the intention and the knowledge of that, I will continue to improve as long as I always come back to what it is that I would like to see for everybody. And that ties into our values and a particular way of going about it. But what I want to see, regardless of the outcome of this election, is an audit of all our policies that we've had. And I want one that goes through it with a decolonial lens and with an evidence-based lens, and also perhaps a relevancy lens. What's in there that still applies to 2020? And what are we missing too? And so then we can give the opportunity to the members to work on the policy to fill those gaps or to rewrite the ones that have been colonial in nature. And I think that one of our issues in communicating our policy in general has been, it has accidentally been through a colonial lens. It's not particularly been the intention, but that's a lot of who we are. So as Greens, that's what the policy has been written as. And then we wonder why Indigenous people, Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations are like, yeah, I'm not so sure about this. When we were like, oh, look at our policy. It doesn't quite work like that. And so I've been trying to take I really care about this. This is what I want to do. This is where I want to advance the conversation, but I shouldn't be writing all the answers. And I have to watch my language, because if we present it in a way that is just recolonization in a sense, in one way or another, it's still defining something for somebody else, then we're just furthering the problem in a new way, when really we need a fully new understanding. So with that, yeah, let's open up the discussion. And the way that we usually do this is Anthony will facilitate, and we do usually speakers list from the chat, or you can raise your hands and you can ask one or both of us, or neither. That doesn't really work. You're welcome to comment, basically, I'm saying. And yeah, Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah, so whoever wants to ask a question first to get things going, go ahead. Otherwise, drop your question in the chat. Or you should have, if you open up the participants panel, you should have a raise hand button, and use that. And I'll try to call people out in the order that I see them.
I think Mr. David Kattenberg wants to jump in. Welcome. Good to see you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a bit quiet, but we can hear you.
Excellent. Amita, it's wonderful. I remember in the very, very, very beginning of the campaign when there was this candidates, and I met you and I was impressed. Amita, I have two questions, and everybody's got a lot of questions, so feel free to be brief. The first question is, have you been to Palestine, Israel? Have you visited the West Bank and the occupied territories? You're nodding your head no. Okay. Maybe you want to comment on that.
I can comment on that, yes. If you'd like me to do so before you continue.
Well, let me ask you my second question. My second question is, I've been very involved in Palestine, Israel, Palestine justice issues in the Greens. I rejoined the Greens because of the BDS resolution back in 2016. And then I was involved in helping to draft the conciliation resolution. Everybody calls it the conciliation, the compromise resolution in Calgary, which was actually a sanctions resolution. It wasn't a BDS resolution. It called for economic actions, but it was essentially, it is, S16 PO13 is a sanctions resolution. Okay, so hugely controversial in the Green Party, and all sorts of people saying, this is incredibly divisive, and you Palestinian activists, you're hijacking the party, yada, yada, yada. I mean, I'm one of them. Like the 35,000 members of the Greens at this moment, I gather, in the lead up to the elections. Do you see the Israel-Palestine issue as divisive within the party? And how do you respond to those who say, stop talking about Palestine, it's just divisive? It's just a bunch of radicals who are thinking about that. Are you aware of that kind of discourse?
Yes, I'm very aware of that kind of discourse.
Seen as being radical and stop talking about Palestine. How do you respond to that?
So, the number of things. First, I think we need to figure out how to talk to each other again, and talk with each other again, and meet at a table of discussion. And I think there's something interesting about us Greens because we don't like division. And in a sense, I agree with that concept, but hold on a second for it. Because I don't want division. I want conversation. I want consensus. I want solutions building. I want getting on the same page. I want that compassion and understanding that I think we must show for each other. But the problem is we end up in a place where the concept of division is divisive. And so we start having a full-on argument about the concept of division. And I think that is just extended down the road, put us further away from where we actually need to be, which is if people feel very strongly about things, about any topic at all, I'm going to widen it out, then we need to be discussing it. I understand for some people in any situation, and this is something that comes up for anybody who's fighting for marginalization. It means life. to fight for rights, for what we believe in and what we need. But from the outside, how many times have I been told the only thing that I'm doing here is fighting for queer and trans rights? Not at all. I don't want to talk about one issue. I want to talk about everything. I want to talk about the future as a party. I want to talk about the future as a country. But I have no choice in my very existence than to fight for my survival, my right to exist, and everything that goes along with it. And so I think we need to recenter that conversation from a really green heart of saying we care for one another. Yes, you can have division in this, but let's figure out actually how to do this in a way that is not divisive at the next level. Let's deal with why we have division here and why it feels that way. Let's talk about the division within the division so that we can move to actually getting on the same page as each other, because that's what being green means. Chris, I think you have something to say here, but I just want to add that I have not traveled because I have not traveled a lot of places and I am young. So I've been studying for a long time and I did not take the time to travel the world when I had the opportunity, and now I'm stuck fighting for its survival. So I would be overjoyed to visit a number of places and understand context a lot better myself, but I have not had that privilege in a sense.
When you go through, let me know and I'll hook you up with some folks who can get you the best knafe in the West Bank and Nablus. David, what you raised there was a very key thing. It's this idea of issue fatigue. And issue fatigue tends to happen when an issue is raised, when that discussion doesn't go well, and people get tired of hearing about it. Another example is in Canada, issue fatigue around electoral reform, because the Trudeau government stole the idea from the Greens and the NDP, to be fair, did it poorly, didn't do it, and now people are tired of hearing about it. There's actually 4 separate buckets in the current issues and discussion around BDS. For those who don't know, BDS is a nonviolent movement called Boycott, Divestment, Sanction. It aims to use economic and cultural sanctions and boycotts to put financial and social pressure on the state of Israel to end the occupation and to decolonize. Similar methods were highly effective against South African apartheid. The 4 elements that matter here are the personal, the procedural, the policy, the practical. What do those mean? Procedural. The way the BDS resolution came up and was pushed through was very divisive. That's unfortunate for a variety of reasons, but that caused a lot of problems within the party. Next, the policy, the specifics of the policy were also divisive. We could argue that singling out a specific feature, BDS, instead of focusing on the ability to sanction or focus on boycotts or sanctions of any country that has human rights violations, such as Saudi Arabia, one could argue China. So the way that was focused on one specific group caused issues. And there are many Jewish people who you know who left the Greens or who associate badly with the Greens because of that. There's the practical piece, which is a lot of folks think that it is not a practical issue to discuss, that the Greens can't have an effect there. I'll explain why it's not the case in a moment. And lastly, the personal piece, the challenges between the person who brought it forth and the Green Party leader at the time. We don't need to go into the details around that, but there were some personal issues around some personalities involved, not seeing eye to eye on how it rolled out. I was asked by someone who doesn't necessarily agree with my positions on a one-state solution or on Palestinian self-determinacy to talk about an issue close to this person's heart, which is climate change and climate justice. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I'm quoting here, predicts the Mediterranean will warm at a rate higher than the global average, between 2.2 and 5.1 degrees Celsius. Tel Aviv was already seeing 45 degrees Celsius heat, and that's set to be high. And that was in May that they were receiving temperatures like that. It's very hot. Currently, about 80% of the water aquifers in historic Palestine are for Israeli use. In the West Bank itself, Israeli settlers use 6 times the water of the entire Palestinian population of the West Bank, about 2.9 million or so. A couple 100,000 use 6 times 2.9 million. So when we talk about aspects of, is this still matter? It does, because we're a party that believes in climate justice. We understand that the climate issues don't affect just Canada, but other areas of the world. It doesn't affect just the Palestine, Israel-Palestine. It affects other countries that have to deal with drought, heat waves, water shortages, and other catastrophic weather events. Last but not least, if someone's sick of hearing about it, that's their damn privilege. It's an important issue, and they should be open to having an understanding of what it means to focus on universal human rights.
I just want to add to that I think the issue of fatigue is very valid for a number of things, and it happens with everything. And here too, though, we do need to get to a place where we all are essentially on the same page about our policy if we intend to get to opposition and governance. And so, unfortunately, or fortunately, that means we have to work through this.
So thank you, David, for the questions. Next up, we have Ethan Berg.
Hello, thank you. So I have two questions, actually. One is, do we know, and I imagine like opinions, or you mentioned about how like only 30-something% of Palestinians believe in a two-state solution and how that is declining. Do we know what percentage of Palestinians favor a one-state solution? And is it possible that that is still less than the two-state solution? Is because I don't know, perhaps things have been changing in recent years because of the because of how right-wing the Israeli government has become, and how much of a failure people are realizing that the Oslo Accords were. And so yeah, I guess my question is like my first question was like, do we know like what percentage of Palestinians see like one binational state in which, you know, the settlements would stay where they are, and like, you know, but like, you know, with right of return for Palestinians and all that, or like what percentage see that as preferable to a two-state solution? And my second question was that like obviously most Israeli Jews and are supporters of the state of Israel are not going to support a one binational state, because it basically because of their anti-Arab racism, and you know, the fact that like unfortunately, you know, many Israeli Jews believe like a lot of racist things about Arabs and don't want to like live in the same space as Palestinians or Arabs more broadly. So like how, or I guess my question then was like, how do you see a one-state solution actually like eventually being implemented? Like what sort of like would it be the international community that would force like Israel to become like one binational state? Would it, or I know the BDS movement doesn't take a stance on like one state or two state, even though its founder I think says that he believes personally in one state. And yeah, like how, because like as opposed as like, you know, as Israel might be to a just two-state solution, like they'd probably be even more opposed to a one-state solution with like right of return for millions of Palestinians, because they see Palestinians as a demographic threat. So like what, or I guess what do you think is the best path to like actually implementing this like decolonized one state? Sorry for going on like that.
Well, we're going to flood the entire water supply of the region with Valium. And then, no, okay. There's a lot of questions there. Let me tell you a story. When I was growing up in Canada, we learned about residential schools, and we learned that residential schools in Canada were schools where First Nations kids could go and learn to be more Canadian. And then we learned about the Holocaust, and then how afterwards Jewish refugees fled and formed a state of Israel. We didn't learn at the time that those residential schools were horrible, genocidal, ethnic cleansing houses of abuse and rape and destruction of culture. We didn't learn at the time that the celebrations of the foundation of Israel were in fact the Nakba, the catastrophe for Palestinians of losing our home. Education of the youth is key. If you read some of the Israeli newspapers, you'll see quotes from some young people who are very progressive and who believe in universal human rights. And you'll hear a lot of quotes from folks who are not. Much like if you go to the States, you have young people who are incredibly open, have broad worldviews, and others who are more prone to support putting kids in cages. Education of the youth is a key part of it. It's going to require a lot of prep. So there were like 15 questions in there, and I'll see if I can address a few of them. Ethan, I admire your efficiency. Putting that many questions at once. That's very good, very efficient.
I'm sorry.
No. A couple of key things. External pressure matters. Having the support of foreign governments allows them to continue their duty with impunity. That's not okay. There was a recent poll by a right-wing Israeli think tank. 1 in 4 US Jews see Zionism as racist, colonial, apartheid movement. That's a quote.
Interesting.
That's a right-wing poll. I was speaking earlier this morning with a young Jewish woman. She's Canadian, Jewish girl. She is doing a school project. We were talking about Green Party policies in the Middle East. She is Jewish. She's also a strong believer in Palestinian human rights because it's about universal human rights. It's going to start with the younger generation. There is also, so basically it requires external pressure from countries and from members of the Jewish community because they're not going to listen to the Palestinians, not going to listen to the Arabs. Unfortunately, the culture that is oppressed doesn't really get a seat at the table. That's one aspect of external pressure. There was another question about polling internally to Palestine. I don't have a specific poll on hand. What do you favor, one state or two state? It's demographic in many ways. A lot of the older generation who still remember what life was like when everything was one state, albeit under the British mandate, but one state, and their neighbors were speaking Hebrew or Arabic, or they spoke English. My grandmother grew up speaking 3 languages. She had her Hebrew neighbors, she had her Arab neighbors, she had Brits who were there. She always enjoyed and fancied the Brits because they were, neat folks who are out of town, to put it mildly. There's a generational split. A lot of the older generation want 2 states because there's some pride there. There's some wanting to go back to what they had. And that's also what they were fighting for a long time, 2 states. A lot of the younger generation is more progressive. Again, it depends on the region. It depends. Usually it's cities tend to be more progressive towards one state. It really depends, because if you're a Palestinian farmer and you're having a tank come through and steal 2/3 of your land, or Israeli soldiers light your olive trees on fire, then chances are you're not going to want to think about one state where they could stay there and keep that land stolen. So it's a lot more complicated. It's also not a well socialized idea, to use a term, socializing idea out to the public. So it's not as easy as saying, well, X% believe this, because it's generational. There are other mitigating factors, and it's not being discussed enough. Peter Beinart, a liberal or progressive Jew, talking about one state, no longer believing a 2-state, talking about one state, is an important move for external pressure to be put on people who have family members there, and on the amount of support coming from primarily the US and other countries. That's a loaded, complicated question. In short, a good compromise leaves everyone unhappy. If you think for a moment a 2-state solution is going to work or be good at all, it's not going to happen. You yourself referenced the failure of Oslo, where I believe it was Ariel Sharon who, paraphrasing, mentioned how we must put a settlement on every mountaintop, grab all the land we can, drag out these negotiations so that we can steal as much land and resources as possible, so that when it does come to a 2-state, there's nothing left. We made a big deal about the annexation of the West Bank, but really, it's already annexed. It's already under Israeli control. Palestinian authorities already under the thumb of the US and of Israel anyways. It's self-financing its own occupation. No one's going to be happy with it. The key thing about any change, we are Greens, we are policy innovators. Other parties like to take our ideas, water them down. I'll often joke that liberals are just Greens without conviction or follow through. We have to be policy innovators. We have to believe in universal human rights, in justice for everyone, social justice, environmental justice, climate justice. We have to keep pushing these concepts and ideas and to keep talking about them. My goal is over the next few years to continue to talk about this idea from a fresh lens, from a one country lens, so that we can bring more people into the fold. I know there are, as you mentioned, a lot of Jewish Canadians, Jewish Americans, Jewish Israelis who feel scared that the big bad Arab will come in. In South Africa, forgive me, things were not perfect. After apartheid ended, they still have major issues, but it wasn't a rampant killing spree. It's not going to be the same in Israel Palestine. It's not going to be, use your words, human. It's the fears people have in Israel Palestine are not legitimate. If people have upward economic mobility, if you're more concerned about sending your kids to school and getting a job, you'll be a little less concerned about trying to go after those around you. This is the haves and the have-nots throughout history. If the haves continue to deny and step on the have-nots, there's going to continue to be a problem. There's no easy answer. It requires political will. What to do about the ultra-right-wing Israeli government, I don't know. The current government of Netanyahu has been compared to Bolsonaro in Brazil and to Trump in the States. The Israeli political system of pure proportional representation has its own problems because it can favor more radical parties, and the whole country has shifted away. It also favors party lists. There's a whole bunch of issues. And I was talking for a while. We had a lot of questions in there. Good compromise leaves everyone unhappy. It's going to require us to finally go, right, this isn't working. 2 states isn't working. Continued discussion isn't working. We stand for universal human rights. We stand for this now. We understand that this is aspects of not just human rights, but of climate justice for those in the region. And we have to act now and quickly. I'll let Amita and others jump in.
I'll speak. I can't speak to the details clearly on what's actually going on, but I can say that I have some connections that organize in Israel, and the kind of overwhelming social change they want to see, and what they see right now in a lot of ways is the propping up of a dangerous right-wing regime that they really don't want to have anything to do with. And so I think there is a lot, educating young people is a big one, but also kind of supporting organization everywhere on the ground that has these discussions. Like, none of this works. We actually just want to all live here. And how can we do this in a way where we feel good at the end of the day? And I think that Christopher said something really important there about fear. And that's kind of the biggest thing that we have to overcome in a lot of these conversations is that, and it's a colonial thing, I would say, that we're taught that, like, you get a piece and that person, therefore this person doesn't have it and everything. But it's that feeling that things will be taken away from you, or that your security is not guaranteed, and all that it makes us want to put up walls. And it's kind of the most dangerous thing that we actually have right now, if I look at the world and the leadership that's popping up. And then also perhaps the antithesis to that, which is a much nicer thing, the openness and the kindness and the compassion that's showing up. But that is a danger that we face internationally going forward into this crisis, especially with the climate crisis, but with other things as well, is the tendency to put up walls to say, I can't worry about you right now. You just have to suffer and die because I don't want to. And that I have to put myself first because there is no other option. So it's in a sense working with everybody on furthering the narratives to break down that concept, and making sure that we understand that this is, it isn't driven by hate. It's driven from people who care and who want better for themselves and don't think that means someone else has to be sacrificed for it. Getting to the concept of justice that is not about retribution, but is, does reflect systemic injustice, historic violence and oppression, and what it means to undo that without causing more violence to somebody else and more oppression to somebody again. And that's it's so necessary. But in a sense, with the idea of not wanting to be recolonial or impose ideas, the whole thing behind this has to come from community organization and from addressing the barriers on the ground that ever present themselves. And I see this, I say this from a wider context because I see it here as well, in the conversations that we need to have about decolonization, but also about how we set up our communities in the future in order to break our own political divisive narrative. We have to address people's fears because they're so worried that if we don't have these camps, stuff is going to be taken away from them. But we have been trained into that mindset. And so it starts, and we see with the youth in our country being like, what is this? Like, especially when you learn young about everything that happened, you're like, oh, okay, what is going on? And no, we won't accept this for the future. And it's that gives me hope. And I think this is where it comes from, but it has to, in a sense, have that organic growth.
We also have to really understand, we say, or in America, we say Black Lives Matter because that's the current group being oppressed. We say Indigenous lives matter. That's the group being oppressed. We say Palestinian lives matter. That's the group being oppressed. I don't mean to go against you here, but to say, well, how do we make the Israeli populace feel safe? That's like saying, well, how do we make the white folk feel safe that the Black folk won't go and try and kill them? Well, that is steeped in racism itself, in racist tropes and in fear.
I agree.
It's very hard to be. It's very hard to talk about peace when there's a boot on your neck.
And sorry, I did not mean to say that we need to be trying to safeguard, like make people feel safe so much as so much of us live in the opposite of that by construction, because you actually are safe, but without the concept of community and being and having some sort of, I don't mean safety as in the fake monsters created about anybody who's racialized or comes from a different background, because I experienced that myself, and fear mongering about who I am. And it's not that so much as the breaking down the narratives of that itself, so that people who basically it's not fear that is conscious, it is fear that is unconscious, in the fact that we are worried that we will lose our homes and our families. And it's unfounded in what I consider reality in some sense, but that's what we live with. And I say that from the context, for me, of having lost my home. And so I watch other people reacting to my story constantly, and I can see the horror of it. And that's where, through that experience, is where I learned that people are so terrified. But the reason they're terrified, like here, of losing their home and their family is because there is nothing else for them. And it's the colonial imposition of the lack of community.
And we have to rely on groups within the Jewish community, such as the amazing work that Independent Jewish Voices Canada does, such as analogous groups like Jewish Voices for Peace in the States, the amazing work they're doing to help educate their community, the Jewish community, on how to basically take away this idea that freedom and justice for Palestinians means a loss for them. I do want to comment on someone posted, Shell, is there a Green Party in Palestine or Israel or both? It is true that the party of Hamas has taken the green color. These green keffiyehs here are something I wear for the Green Party of Canada things. They have no relation to Hamas. I have lots of keffiyehs. I have a multicolored one, a rainbow one that I wear at Pride events as well, in celebration of allyship for queer folks around the world. So it's just Green Party, the language, it'd have to be called something a bit different, like maybe the Earth Party or something like that, if it were to start growing in, at least in the Palestinian side.
I think that I believe that there is a Green Party of Israel, and right now they're in the process of setting one up in Palestine.
I think
my understanding anyway.
If I could jump off of something that was said about, I think Peter Beinart, in his long article in Jewish Currents, if I remember correctly, he actually speaks about the trauma that that the Jewish people experienced in the Holocaust, and then this unfortunate reality that we have, that like people are brainwashed to believe that like, you know, that like Palestinians would do the same. That like, I mean, I think he basically says that like, you know, it's almost as if like Palestinians are being like portrayed in a certain sense as like genocidal or like as Nazis. Um and how like obviously that's racist and wrong, but also like, you know, steeped in like people's need for like a sense of, or like the trauma that people have experienced and their like need for security. So I mean, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but I think
Well,
it's, I guess like one thing he's basically saying is that like we need to basically stop like calling or like talking about Palestinians as if they were Nazis, and like actually like, you know, um realize that like we can all live together and like coexist in peace.
it's true. I don't know how to goose step. I don't plan on learning that anytime soon. There is a lot of demonization of the Arabs.
Mm.
And here's the other thing as well. You have to understand, these are 17, 18-year-old Israeli kids who have little to no exposure to what's really going on, on the Palestinian side, who are not taught about their real history. There are academics like Ilan Pappé, who Israeli academic who has left Israel because of all the cover-up of history in many ways. You give these 17 or 18-year-old kids a gun and you say, these people are dogs, they're trying to kill you and your family.
Yeah.
Only you can protect them. Don't give them an inch because of our history and what's happened to us.
Yeah.
It's going to be very messy, and it's going to require a lot of external pressure and internal pressure to change that mindset. And if you have the ability, can you imagine if you had military units serving side by side of Christians, Muslims, Jewish people? It would take a while to get there to build those levels of trust. But now you're creating a collective experience, and collective experiences bind people together. I've joked, said that Arabs in general, especially Palestinians in North America, are about where Jewish people were about 40 or 50 years ago, where there's lots of tropes. People don't believe us. We have to fight harder to be heard. We have to justify our existence. And it's a challenging place to be. I'm white passing. I have lighter skin than most Arabs. My father, instead of letting me have my Arabic first name, Faris, he gave me Christopher so I could blend in more easily. So I had a much easier experience than a lot of Muslims or a lot of people who have darker skin. So I've got to see a bit of the easy life, but I also understand the challenges, severe challenges that are faced by a lot of Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians in North America, let alone in Palestine.
I want to speak to the trauma piece a little bit there, because it's something that I live with, and that's, I think, you know, where the perspective comes from, and watching what I see is kind of so many people living with trauma, with not knowing that, because we're steeped in it. We don't know how much it has shaped our worldview. We don't know what it's even from, and living in the society that we have, the way we have it, is pretty traumatizing in its own way a lot of the time. And there are so many different levels of it and different ways for it to happen. But you know, what I see in the travesty of the situation is that there's so much traumatization continuing, and it is institutionalized, and it's so painful, because in it there is no justice, there is no peace, there is no chance for us to heal. And we need to heal for so many generations now. And it is really hard work. And so, yeah, messy is one word for it, but I think that there's, you know, there are so many levels to trauma, and to the conversation of what that even is, and the fact that we avoid it because it's combined into the discussion of mental health, which of course it is, but the fact that we have such stigma around mental health, and we just ignore then the continuation of traumatization of people so much. And in every instance of that, especially when it's systemic, all you're doing is furthering injustice and giving ourselves more work in the process of undoing systemic violence and oppression and healing for everyone.
In the same way that we rely on North American and European Jewish people to put external pressure on Israeli Jewish people, there's a role for people like me, born not in Palestine, but born here, where I can see that there must be an acknowledgement of this intergenerational trauma that is in part of the Jewish psyche that has been acknowledged by Peter Beinart and others. But we can't solve trauma by arming it to the teeth and encasing it in a panic room. We have to process that out. In South Africa, that was with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. There are a lot of continuing re-traumatizing fears that are going on in the Middle East, some of those due to hostile neighboring countries, some of those due to internal fears being stoked by governments trying to get their people to stay on the side of being conservative. There's a lot there. The trauma is a big aspect. I am not a mass psychologist. That's a whole different bag of bees. It does have to be addressed. What we can do here as Greens is we can start to have this discussion around it takes not just acknowledging of that trauma of the Jewish people, both in North America here, who are pushing against these policies of integration in one country, but also of Jewish Israelis, many of whom don't know what they weren't taught in school, just like I wasn't taught that about First Nations people growing up. So we have to have these discussions about there can be another way based in universal human rights, based in climate justice, based in a real lasting peace, and based in a strong awareness of the damages that the climate crisis will have in the Middle East. And that we can do so from a decolonial lens, which doesn't mean you now have less, but it means we now get to make sure that we are safer, healthier, freer than we ever have been before. I dream of a day when I can go with some of my friends who are Jewish Israeli here. I know this isn't the I have a black friend thing, that defense of claiming it. This is the I have Jewish Israeli friends here. I want to go back to the Middle East with, and I would love to spend time in the beach in Tel Aviv with them, and love to bring them to Ramallah, love to bring them through Bethlehem and show them the other side of the coin. But that's not something that can happen if it's this messed up two-state solution where apartheid is continued and where human rights and climate justice are not at the forefront. So I know we're approaching towards the end here. So in the discussions we come in, I want to try and see what we can do to wrap it in this concept of what Greens can do now. We can talk about this idea. We can socialize it to others. We can look at our existing policies and realize how outdated they are. They are not steeped in Indigenous self-determination. They're steeped in colonial mess.
On that note, I want to address two of the things that are in the chat here, which is how can the Green Party better accommodate these voices of opposition in the internal debates on policy and platform? And also, could the GPC reach out to the nascent Green Party of Palestine and Israel to inquire and work on policies such as this? I've met some of the people from international Green Parties, and I am very much looking forward to that work and that conversation. And again, I actually think they're already in conversation with each other. So I think it's going to be like, from the facilitation and support standpoint, much like we, as I think as a Green Party of Canada, we want to be supporting the municipal and provincial counterparts instead of saying, hey, I know what's best, be like, is there any way that I can work in solidarity with you in a way that can support and that can help whatever process you need? And in terms of the party itself, I think, during this campaign, my campaign comes from the point of view that policy is absolutely member driven, but we put out a full platform. So the point of that was to practice the experience itself of policy development. What is it that we can do? So we developed that process into something that is wholesome and integral and shareable so that we can really make our policy development process robust. And through the lenses that we did that, also about the accessibility of communication, that is why our platform looks the way it does and reads the way it does. And so I think that there is a way And it is through empowerment and through justice and through challenging the hierarchies to say, if we want something to be truly democratic and member driven, there has to be space for everything and the discussion. And here is how we approach these discussions in a way that's going to stay respectful. And I promise you, we had disagreements about the policies that ended up in the platform. We're still arguing about some of them, but that's kind of the point, is that there is a lot to work through. And it's about creating the space and the structure for people to actually be able to have those conversations in a way that is also going to be clearly have connection to our values and connection to evidence, and a process to make sure it goes through evidence. And then in the lens of tonight, make sure that we understand how to keep it decolonial, because we know that pretty much everybody shows up with their own biases. I have mine. And you inject that into the concepts that you put forward. In our policy process, stuff was brought up. It's like, well, actually, you're not, that ignores this. I'm like, oh my goodness, yes. And you need multiple voices. Otherwise, you don't actually get the differentiation that you need. You don't get the multiple perspectives. And so I think even in situations when we're developing policy as Green Party members, when everybody agrees, we should try to disagree. And so it's more than just creating the chance for opposition, dissent, and disagreement. It's finding it. If we all actually happen to agree on something, we better go find out why. And maybe it's because we all had some sort of frame that we came with, and we don't know if that's going to be the best thing to accomplish our values. So in the policy process, that has to be baked into the structure, the way we accomplish it. And it's about challenging the mindset. And I think especially right now, where the Green Party does need to kind of work to diversify. I don't like focusing on the concept of identity in that, for sure, but we haven't always had the other voices around to speak their truth. And so there isn't that opportunity. And even then, nobody should be speaking for their entire demographic ever. So there is a responsibility, even when you do have somebody offering a different perspective, to find more. And I think that you actually don't get policy that's truly evidence-based until you are checking all the backgrounds. And in the center of that conversation around our values, we have to get on the same page, because that's how we are going to have the conversation where people can show up and disagree, and it's going to be respectful, because we have to come back to the center if at any point we feel uncomfortable. Feeling uncomfortable when we're being challenged on things is fine, but I mean, like, if we feel hurt in any way, we have to come back to the center so we're not causing that to each other. And right now, I think our values are a little bit amorphous, and I'd like to go through the process of centering and understanding that with everybody, so we have that method of engagement.
If I may add to this broader policy discussion, I want to take a step back here for a moment. This isn't just about Amita's positions and their discussions on decolonization. There are other candidates in the race currently who share similar or close or somewhat understandable visions that there needs to be a different discussion around the Middle East. Leadership races are one of the best times to shape policy within a party. After this race is over, there are still going to be people who agree and who disagree with changing the way we look at policy in many areas, including the Middle East. This race is not this party is not a one-issue party. This one is obviously close to my heart, and it's obviously close to many as a litmus test for human rights and who we want to be as a party and as people. So as we're having these ongoing discussions, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be an ongoing discussion. You may have recalled I mentioned we're not going to be able to solve the Middle East crisis or the Green Party's position on it in an hour and a half, although I think we came pretty close, folks. So please do talk with other candidates, not just leadership candidates in the next election. Talk with other candidates about this. Talk to members of your riding association about this. Talk to your crazy aunts and uncles about this. Talk to people you know and care about. Make this idea something more than just, oh, one state, oh, that'll never work. They hate each other. No, that will work. It can work. It's the only solution that actually is steeped in universal human rights. It's the only solution that can actually look at things from a decolonial lens, from climate justice. And until we're willing to have this conversation respectfully, regularly, then it's not going to work. So I'd encourage everyone to please do that. gently bring the topic up, be respectful of people's boundaries. You can even ask them permission. Hey, can we talk about this topic at the moment? Not everyone wants to talk about it. Just because I'm Palestinian doesn't mean I give you permission to walk up. Oh, hey, I want to talk to you about this. Just because I'm wearing a keffiyeh, which is kind of like a Scottish tartan in many ways, doesn't mean I want to talk about the Middle East. It could just be cold. Winter's coming.
Thank you so much. And as we wrap up, thank you so much for being our guest tonight and for sharing and for bringing this conversation forward. And in general, I think just contributing a lot to the way we approach everything. Thank you for
Shukran
that.
jazilan, yatikum al-afiyah. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm always happy to chat with this, folks. You can always send me a note. I'll put my email in the chat if you want to talk about Middle East policy, just in general. I'll put it in here and folks can send me a note. I'm happy to discuss.
With that, thank you everyone for coming, your questions and your discussion, and also for approaching this respectfully, because it can be, it's a, you know, where everybody comes from, it can be tricky. So I'm really happy with that. And also we are coming to the end of this leadership race with voting starting online on the 26th, or of course, if you got your mail-in ballot earlier. And since I am a candidate, I do have to talk about this at the end of this. And simply to say, you know, consider what we are putting forward to the country and the way that we want to approach the national conversation and the opportunity from a larger angle that the Green Party has to contribute to the national stage and the global stage as well. And I want to also just extend an open invitation to anybody who would like to join our campaign. We're having a lot of fun, and we have some true volunteer work to get done in this last week and a half. So everyone's welcome, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Amita and Anthony, for organizing. Much appreciated. This is great. See, this was fun. We had a fun conversation about Israel Palestine. It's possible.
Thanks, Amita.
Thank you. And hopeful. So what gets me is that in everything we're doing and what we present, you know, it's so important to talk about the realities that we face, but it's also important to talk about hope. And that's why I liked your story so much about being able to go back with friends. It's because it's about the connection. It's about what we hope for that actually is, it's not to do with the politics. It's to do with something more beautiful.
I was talking on the phone today with somebody. I was pitching for someone else, and they said they were going to vote for you. So there you go. Go Amita.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Amita.
Thanks, folks.